Hello and welcome to the second series of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding podcast. In this series, we are looking at the literature of China. It is a type of writing read by over 500 million people. Its readership accounts for half of China's population, and it is especially popular among young people. Chinese readers spend £5.5 billion on it each year. But very few people in the West have heard of Chinese internet fiction, and fewer still have read any. Internet literature, that is to say, fiction which is written for and published on websites and apps, has been part of Chinese internet culture since the country first came online in the 1990s. It has evolved into a unique and distinctive literary form, which is as widely read as print fiction in the West. There are about 33 million writers in China producing fiction online. Some are professionals, but others are part-timers, who could be anything from delivery drivers to professors. But 80% of new writers are from Generation Z. Chinese online literature includes a vast array of genres. Some of these, like the hugely popular cultivation novels, or xianxia, simply don't exist in Western writing. The stories can be absolutely colossal. Some of the longest novels reach over 40 million characters and have been running in serialization for nearly a decade. Online fiction is now a massive influence on Chinese popular culture more broadly. Online published works have been adapted into films, animations, television shows, and video games. Adaptions are worth £40 billion a year, making millionaires of the writers. And interest is growing overseas. Spending on Chinese online literature from abroad grew 11% last year. AI translation is making more of these works available than ever. To find out more about Chinese online fiction, I spoke to Andrew Rule, a Beijing-based translator who publishes the Cold Window newsletter on Substack. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself to the listeners?
Of course. I'm Andrew Rule, based in Beijing right now. I'm a master's student at Peking University at an international program called Yanqing Academy, where I study contemporary Chinese literature, and I also translate contemporary Chinese books, write a Substack called the Cold Window newsletter about contemporary Chinese books. I do some book reviews, spend as much of my time as I can reading this stuff.
What started your personal interest in contemporary Chinese literature generally and Chinese online fiction specifically?
It happened unexpectedly. I grew up in the United States, in California. I had a lot of friends of Chinese descent growing up, so I had Chinese around me when I was younger. And loved reading, loved studying languages. I expected to be a French major in college, but then when I got to my university, I took a Chinese class, mostly for fun, and found myself really enjoying the challenge of the language. And since I had an interest in translation already, I was thinking about which between my two foreign languages I was studying I wanted to focus on translating. And it was very clear that there was a greater need of translation from Chinese. There's so many books that come out from China that so few people know about outside of China, and not all that many translators working on them. So I decided to really double down and do some study in China. The more times I came here, the more I liked it, and the more I realized how much good stuff there is to read here that people outside of China don't know much about. That was all the contemporary literature side. The internet literature interest started much more recently. After I arrived at my current university, there's an amazing professor named Shao Yanjun, who's been researching Chinese internet literature basically since it came around in the mid-2000s. She was really the first scholar in China to pick up on this new literary form and start codifying the study of it. So I was lucky enough to take her class here. She's been teaching this class on the history of the history of Chinese internet literature for I think more than 15 years. It's a legendary class, and taking that class and realizing how huge of a domain of literature was out there on the internet that readers in the West don't know much about, translators don't know much about, publishers don't know much about, and even within China, a lot of literary experts don't pay a lot of attention to. It felt like I had discovered a secret room in the library. I started reading it really widely and writing about it in English as much as I could.
Would you mind briefly outlining the scale of that scene? Give us a sense of what sort of proportion it is, how big it is, how popular it is.
It's hard to express how huge it is. I mean, in my life, the best expression of how widespread and influential it is just that if you step onto the subway in any city in China and you look around at what is on people's phones, if they're not watching Douyin, if they're not watching TikTok videos, they're probably reading internet novels. It's a really, really common way for people of all age groups, but especially young people, to pass the time. And when I started taking this class, I was asking my Chinese friends around if they had ever had any exposure to internet novels, since I had barely heard of this genre. And everybody has read these novels. They don't talk about it necessarily very much because it's considered sort of a lowbrow way to pass your time. But once you get people talking about their favorite books, everybody I know read these when they were kids. I mean, the Chinese schooling system is very intense in the middle and high school level. And this is how a lot of kids pass their time, is reading these historical romance novels or these fantasy novels, martial arts novels. They're really relaxing. They sort of activate the same centers in your brain that a video game would. Like they're very casual and non-taxing way to get stories into your brain. It is kind of like watching a TV show or something. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the economic size of this industry is in China, but it's massive. This is a really, really big part of the publishing sector in China.
That was why I was kind of keen to do this podcast about it, because it is something that just certainly doesn't register in like the popular consciousness in the West about like what's Chinese culture like, what are people interested in. You mentioned it's considered lowbrow. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting because I have been reading these novels and I think that there's a lot of artistic merit to a lot of them. But I think the feeling of maybe light embarrassment or sheepishness at least that comes out when you start asking people what their favorite online novels are, I think it comes from the fact that these are, they're serialized novels, very, very long. Often they run to thousands of chapters, and each chapter is sort of meant to hook you and keep you on to the next chapter, which is format as old as time all over world literature, obviously.
Yeah, that's how Dickens wrote.
Yeah, famously. Lots of serialized novels, but that's not really how we think of contemporary literature. We think of contemporary literature as a complete product that sort of sprung from genius and exists outside of commercial incentives, whereas these internet novels do sort of wear the commercial incentives on their sleeve. They're explicitly meant to hook you and get you coming back to read the next chapter again and again and again every single day. And I think that could be why people who profess themselves as literary readers would be hesitant to bring up an online novel as their favorite form of literature, even though all the literary readers that I know also read internet novels. It's definitely part of the same thing. It just wears its commercialism a little bit on its sleeve, a bit more.
Would you mind, and I realize I might be asking you to summarize an entire university course here in a couple of minutes, but would you mind briefly outlining the sort of like how the Chinese web fiction scene works, how it emerged, who writes it, how it's consumed and accessed, like on a practical level?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most interesting things I learned in that course is that it didn't really emerge from any pre-existing high literary tradition. It's much more as an offshoot of like the Japanese manga and comics and light novels ecosystem. Video games, it's more part of that specifically online genealogy. And part of the reason that it became so popular so early on in China in a way that it never really did in the West is that China's print publishing ecosystem was not that developed by the time the internet came around. Obviously, China had been publishing books and magazines during the Republic of China in the earlier 20th century. After the Cultural Revolution, literary production was ramping up again in the 80s and 90s. But still, buying novels for leisure in mainland China was not as common around the mid to late 90s in China as it was in Taiwan or in Hong Kong, and certainly in the West, in Europe and the US. So it was the Chinese publishing market as a commercial leisure industry was not all that developed when the internet came along and provided a very convenient and basically free way for tons of people to read stories. So the internet became more of an essential way for people to access literature earlier on in China than in other places. Also, internet coverage was not all that great in a lot of parts of China at that point, so text was a good way for people to use the internet as opposed to images or videos. So I think it became sort of indispensable to a lot of younger people looking to read stories in the early 2000s, even before it became commercial. At that point, it was a lot of fan fiction being written and some wuxia, so martial arts inspired stories. The industry as we know it now is much more heavily commercialized because around the later 2000s, companies like Qidian is the big one. There's another one that came along later called Fanxie. These companies discovered how much market potential there was for these novels and discovered basically that there was enough value there to contract authors full time. If they promised authors a set salary, that was a livable salary in return for them writing. Depends on the author how many characters a day, but I think I've often heard it's 5,000, 7,000. Some people write 10,000 characters in a day. It's a lot of writing that you have to do. But as long as you hit this minimum amount, you can get this contract fee from these companies, and it's your full-time job. So this is a way for young people who don't really necessarily have a lot of connections in publishing would be able to get a formal book deal to be full-time writers from early on in their careers. And then they also can get extra money based on the number of readers they bring in. It's a kind of a fascinating model that incentivizes young people to experiment a lot and constantly change around their formula to come out on top and get as many views as they can on their stories. I think that's part of why, since this model came out, I think it was around 2008, but definitely in the late 2000s. So it's now been around for almost 20 years. But the genres and what is popular in these novels evolves extremely rapidly because these authors are constantly trying to figure out ways to attract attention from readers and, come out on top in what is, at this point, a very, very, very crowded field.
I was going to ask if it's like a matter of quantity over quality. I mean, do you think that idea of quantity over quality is unfair, or do you think that does reflect it a bit?
No, I think it's fair. I think that it's undeniable that out of the vast, vast, vast amounts of internet novels produced every year, most of them are not good. Most of them are very lowest common denominator. And there are many problems with a lot of these novels of sexist content and everything. But the thing is that coming at it from the outside, me encountering it 20 years into its development, the minority of the stuff in there that is really good and really high quality, it still amounts to untold hundreds of thousands or millions of pages. And I think that applies to individual novels too. There's definitely a tendency, especially in the novels written for male audiences. The novels are often, for commercial reasons, divided explicitly between Nanpian, which is male channel, like more adventure-y, male-oriented stories, and then Nupian, which is more classically romance stories. Obviously, male readers read the female stories and vice versa, but this is how the novels are often categorized. And the male-oriented stories do have a reputation for spanning absurd lengths, just sort of spinning out their story, starting out really strong for a couple hundred chapters, and then spinning out their stories to 2,000, 3,000, 400 chapters because their readers tend to be willing to put up with an interminable story. And as long as you can keep your readers going, you'll keep writing the thing. But the really good stories, the ones that are the most worth translating, the ones that I enjoy reading the most, tend to be the tighter ones, where an author writes until they run out of ideas, and then they wrap up the story and move on to the next one. Those can often run to 200, 300, sometimes as much as 600 or 700 chapters. So still, it would be a lot if you printed it out into a book. Yeah. But that is very short compared with some of these true behemoth novels.
Yeah, 3,000 chapters. I thought Dream of the Red Chamber was a bit too long, but
it is funny that the classic Chinese novels are very, very long when you translate them into English. Dream of the Red Chamber is 5 volumes in English, and that tradition has continued even now for entertainment. Chinese readers seem to be willing to put up with very, very long stories. It's a translation challenge, but also kind of a cultural difference that I admire a lot. People have so much patience for long stories.
We're definitely going to talk about the good stuff and like the quality stuff that comes out of this genre. But I think I have to ask, what distinguishes the lowest common denominator in Chinese web fiction? What does that look like?
I do think the criticisms it gets the most are for sexist content, because that sells pretty well. The cliches that you hear about if you talk to people who really don't like these novels are that the male-oriented ones can sometimes be vaguely pornographic. Obviously, this is on the Chinese internet where there's a lot of censorship, so many of these novel platforms have a rule that you can't describe anybody's body below the neck, which I think is pretty funny. But even so, people find ways to use euphemism and write some of these sort of more questionable and problematic stories. And then the female-oriented novels, a lot of the criticism you hear is about it's called bazong stories, which is dominant boss, overbearing boss. It's a lot of like stories about workplace stories about a sort of dominant, overbearing, romantic male lead and a submissive female character. These tend to sell really well, but they're not the literary classics that are begging for translation into English. But then other things, there are some novels that are considered relatively lowbrow in a genre called danmei, which is boys' love stories. That's stories written usually by female authors, usually for a female readership, but about gay male pairings, gay male romance. And those stories in China are often considered lowbrow, or it's embarrassing to read them. But there's some really, really interesting and impressive literary innovations that happen in the danmei space, partly because this is sort of a gray area or subversive way to write stories. The Chinese internet and Chinese literature don't often explicitly treat gay themes. So even though these stories are considered sort of silly or embarrassing a lot of the time in the Chinese market, once you bring them over to the English side, you realize that there's a lot of creativity and daring going on in these stories.
Danmei literally means addicted to beauty or something like that, if I remember correctly. What makes those that interesting as a genre, in your opinion? Because there is definitely a market for that in the West, as I've found out while researching for this episode.
Definitely.
What is it, do you think, about that genre that make it a bit more interesting in a literary sense?
I think the key is that it looks like a genre from the outside because it does have certain tropes that repeat again and again. I mean, it's called danmei, addicted to beauty, because it spun off from a Japanese light novel tradition of romance stories that were about attraction and fate and not about sex. And that's true even now. A lot of these Chinese danmei stories don't have sexual content in them. It's all about the romance and the yearning. But so there are genre tropes in danmei, but it's not really a genre because you can have a danmei story be about anything. There's danmei stories that take place in a space opera. There's danmei stories that are about classical Chinese mythology. There's contemporary school stories, martial arts fiction. I've read some that are horror danmei. I mean, any genre that you can imagine can be written in this format. And it's often a way for female authors to experiment with genre tropes that have historically been dominated by male authors. The danmei writing space is usually by women and usually for women. So you can get some interesting and challenging gender themes in your hard sci-fi or in your historical battle strategy stories. I don't know. There's all sorts of different stories that are sort of wrenched out of the ossified genre track or the cliches because they're being written as danmei stories instead.
One of the questions I was going to ask you is like, what distinguishes this scene from mainstream publishing? But I almost wonder if, certainly in terms of numbers, if it's wrong to think about like there being like publishing, like with a publishing house being the mainstream and this being a subculture. Is it probably fair to say that this is the mainstream and like literary, like printed fiction with like with the Chinese equivalent of Penguin or so on and so forth, that would almost be more of a subculture in 2026.
It depends on how you look at it. I think in 2026, we're seeing both of them sort of uncomfortably living alongside of each other because the prestige is definitely still in traditional publishing. The money that comes from the government, which is obviously very important in China to have official support, that still tends to go more to traditional publishing. But the fact is that authors often write both. Authors often switch from one to the other. And they write under different names because web novels are typically written under a poetic pseudonym, whereas it's more common for a literary novel to be written under your own name. But many authors cross between both of them. And the sort of cultural establishment in China is starting to come around to internet literature, is starting to prepare literary awards for online authors and professional organizations. So even though at the moment, I think internet literature is more squarely mainstream for readers and traditional literature is more squarely mainstream for the cultural establishment, it's hard to say for sure that that'll still be true in 5 or 10 years.
You mentioned about pseudonyms. Obviously, using a pen name's got a very long history in Chinese writing. Is that the default? Do people always use a pen name or a pseudonym, or do people tend to publish under their own names?
Online, I think it is nearly 100% of people use pseudonyms, which is quite interesting. I think these days it is hard to do anything online without your real identity being attached to it some way or another. And that's true of these novels too. Their real identities are attached to what they write, unless they're writing on sort of smaller fan fiction channels. But if they're making money from it, it's definitely attached to their real name. But their civilian identity, their day-to-day identity, is kept separate from their internet persona in the eyes of the fans. Quite explicitly, I found out. I mean, I write this blog about contemporary Chinese literature, mostly literary stuff, and I've interviewed many authors for it. I found literary authors are very happy to talk about their work with me. They're very easy to reach online, whereas internet authors are nearly impossible to reach personally for interviews or for conversations because it is kind of a cutthroat industry. There are so many of them. They're fighting so hard for slivers of attention from their audiences, and they need to protect their contracts with these platforms that publish their work very carefully. So I've learned that it is highly discouraged for fans to try to reach out to authors personally. You're supposed to treat them as a source of stories, and you can interact with them in the comment sections. They often will be very active in the comment sections of their own novels. But as people or as personas outside of their work, they don't really exist. And if they want to exist, they tend to do it under their own name in their literary writing rather than in their online writing.
That's so interesting. Can you give any examples of like what sort of responses you've had when you've tried to contact people?
I do have a small number of friends I've made offline who I found out later are accomplished internet novelists. So that's how I've been able to learn about this system. But I've been stonewalled pretty much when I reach out to authors directly through the usual channels. They tend to have media teams who handle their outside appearances. Like I said, this internet ecosystem is starting to become more recognized and valued by the cultural establishment, including universities. And there have been some academic panels where these authors make a rare offline appearance to talk about their work to academics. And I've been to some of those events too. And obviously, college students in China can be very, very excited to finally get a chance to glimpse the face behind the pseudonym that's been writing their favorite stories ever since they were in middle school. But besides those sort of very formal and carefully controlled appearances, it can be really hard to get a hold of them. Part of this is for their own protection too, obviously. If you're an internet celebrity, I think this is true all over the world, you can have very intense fans who want to develop a parasocial relationship with you, and you have to keep up certain barriers. That's sort of the price of intense online fandom.
Sure, but a lot of people want to be celebrities. So it's really interesting to me that there's this default and like focus on secrecy and privacy, which I think is very different to what you get in certainly online writing in the West, people do have a desire to be famous and a celebrity, and people want to be a celebrity and internet famous in China. So I'm
Yeah.
curious as to why, with this particular format, people are so focused on their own privacy and like not letting their real face get out there.
Well, it's interesting that the the closest industries I can think of in the West would be social media influencers. There are also people who have to produce a certain amount of content for a very, very devoted fan base online and sort of manage their brand constantly and keep changing things around enough that they maintain their fan base while also staying consistent enough that people don't lose interest in them. So that's all very similar. But the difference between a social media influencer in the West and a web novel author in China is these large platforms that pay their salary. These, in the end, are salaried workers. They have contracts that can be very, very generous if they become a highly valuable asset for the company and are bringing in a lot of readers. And the most important thing is to keep that contract. So for the most part, I think that it's not really in the interest of these companies to have the authors be engaging with fans a lot outside of the platform. I think the platforms themselves are hoping that the engagement happens within the novel itself and within the comment section itself and within certain carefully prepared chat events. In this way, I don't follow Japanese pop fandom or Korean idol fandom or anything, but it seems like it may be more similar that way because those are also highly internet-ified celebrity figures who are trying to maintain large fan bases while at the same time have a lot of their actions and public presence controlled by a company.
That's a really interesting point I think you've made. Like, do you think there's an element of like it gives the company more control if the relationships with the online persona, who ultimately they've got a bit of control over, than it is with the first name, surname, picture of their face, the real person behind it?
Yeah, I think it does. These companies are also in intense competition with each other. TDN is definitely the largest one especially for the male-oriented novels. There's one called Jinjiang Wenxuechong that is the biggest player for danmei and female-oriented novels. Fanxie is very big, but there's only a handful of these really large companies, and they are constantly jockeying with each other for market share. So I think the restrictions put on these authors to ensure that they don't jump ship and move and switch to another company are also quite intense.
And do you have a sense of the business models for these companies and like how people get recruited and so on and so forth? Like
Recruitment, I'm not sure. I do know that the business model can vary a bit between different companies. And obviously, I experience this much more as a reader than as a professional. But you can see it as a reader too. Some of the companies pay authors to meet the terms of their contract and write a certain number of chapters and keep readers invested long term. And these tend to produce very long novels, but that have sort of an overall story arc that moves a little bit more slowly because there's a long-term business plan for keeping readers coming in, and because the author themselves is not pressed to get a certain number of views on every single chapter. Whereas other companies, Fanxie is famously this way, their novels are free. You have to look at ads to read the novels, but the novels themselves are free. So the main revenue that comes into these to Fanxie is views. They just want to get as many views as possible. So the author is explicitly incentivized to have a lot of action and excitement in every single chapter, and that tends to produce much more sort of jagged, uneven stories that are constantly at a level 11. Very different kind of story model than if your chapters are being bought by readers. Sometimes it's often just 2 or 3 kuai which is very little money. That's less than 50 US cents to buy a chapter. But if your readers are buying it chapter by chapter, then they'll develop a relationship with the book and are willing to put up with a longer, more emotionally invested story.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit more about that relationship between the writer and the audience? Because there's always we're used to fandoms in the West, but it's it's quite interesting to me that it's like that you've framed it in a way like a social media influencer or a um what was the other, or like a K-pop idol group. I think that's quite interesting that you're able to get that sort of commercial fan relationship with people who are just completely anonymous, because I think it's useful to like emphasize that like some of the most famous authors in China coming out of China often are anonymous. So like MXTX, probably one of the best known authors in the West, but nobody knows what her name is or anything about her. Can you talk a bit more about like author fan relationships, that sort of dynamic, and how that plays out in this format?
My understanding is that there's not much of a relationship between author and fan because of this anonymity. It's an intense relationship between the author, or between the fan and the text. People develop really strong relationships with the story, and with the characters in the story. And that's what keeps people going back, and what builds loyalty to an author. There are people who will read anything an author writes because they have developed such a relationship with the characters from a prior novel. MXTX, you're right, is by far the most successful Chinese web novel author to have been translated into English. Her books, when they first came out from a small press in the US in English, jumped to the top of the New York Times bestseller list immediately, which has never happened before or since with a translated Chinese novel. And yet, yeah, her identity is not publicly known. There is speculation about it, but the anonymity, especially for an author like her who writes queer-themed literature, is protected by her company, protected by herself, and by a lot of her fans. They also protect her from harassment. So I often hear people speculating about the real identities of certain authors. Sometimes there are things like if an author was a graduate of your own university and is writing stories about university, then that means that people from that university will be excited to go read stories that feel familiar. But explicit details about life are not something you ever really get to have about the author. You need to get it all from the text.
Yeah. And I think MXTX is a very interesting example because she's like a couple of years ago, despite being the most well known in the West, she just completely stopped publishing about 2 years ago. And from what I understand, nobody knows nobody knows why. There's lots of rumor and speculation about why she stopped publishing, and no one knows what's actually happened there.
Well, it's true, but she writes within Danmei, and she is known for more explicit danmei that has more explicit sexual material in it. That was possible to write on the Chinese internet 10 years ago, a bit over 10 years ago, but censorship has gotten much stricter since then. I think 2014, and then also later in the later in the 2010s, there were a couple waves of censorship and also self-censorship by the platforms that make the sorts of novels that MXTX was writing and became extremely well known for not really possible to write anymore. So she's still a beloved figure. It's not just in the West. Also in China, she is the progenitor of extremely valuable IP. If you go into any 7-Eleven, you'll probably find figurines of her characters from her novels. There's one called Tianguan Sifu, and the characters from Tianguan Sifu are everywhere in Chinese popular culture. These have all been turned into animated TV shows and live-action TV shows. A show called The Untamed that was very popular in the West a couple years ago is based on one of her novels. So none of that has gone away. Her work is still everywhere, and her fandom is still there too, and looking for other ways to fill in the void now that she's gone. But her work, her as an author, it's the environment, the regulatory environment that allowed her to write those novels is not here anymore, and she's not writing anymore either.
Yeah, yeah. And how does the mainstream deal with the popularity of this? Are the mainstream publishers trying to get in on the act, or is there still a bit of snobbishness? Because you said that people are quite sheepish about talking about their interest in this, despite the fact everyone's reading it.
Yeah.
How does the mainstream, if we can talk about the mainstream, respond to internet publishing?
I can think of two ways to interpret mainstream there. One would be like
Mm,
print publishing, which is obviously designed for the more formal literary stuff, but often these internet novels, when they get popular enough, do come out with a print run. The print
mm,
run tends to be subject to closer scrutiny by the censors, so it often doesn't have all of the content from the original internet novel. And also, um, it's competing with online, like the online version. It's free or very cheap to read the online version, so there needs to be a lot of in, intentional marketing and other perks and beautiful design in these books to get fans to spend money to rebuy a book they may have already read online. But traditional publishing, as in the print industry, has already for a long time been finding ways to monetize print editions of these internet novels. But in terms of the pure literature, 严肃文学, the serious literature side of publishing, um, I do feel like there is frustration in that area with internet literature, because for whatever reason, book sales in China have been dropping precipitously for the last couple of years since the pandemic. Literary novels now have a really hard time selling anywhere close to the number of copies they used to sell a few years ago. And uh, you'll often hear readers, authors, publishers speculating that this is because people prefer to read internet novels now. I personally think that is not necessarily true. It seems to me that readers all over the world are facing a lot of distractions from print or literary novels, and it's a good thing that Chinese popular culture is still so invested in text-based entertainment. People still want to read novels. It doesn't seem like it's mutually exclusive that people would be reading internet and literary novels at the same time. But for whatever reason, I think there is a perception that these less carefully edited and more explicitly commercially motivated novels are taking away
mm.
market share from literature, and that does cause some friction, I think.
Is there sort of like a criticism of this as a format in sort of like cultural criticism of this format?
I hope so. I haven't seen much of it, but I also don't see everything that's going on the internet. I
Yeah,
definitely don't
no.
think that there's um, the critical magazines and literary critical journals in China tend to be very highbrow and academic. There's not really
Mm,
like a middle brow, I don't know, London Review of Books or New York Times Book Review um, tradition of periodicals like that are for a general audience but are doing literary criticism and cultural criticism. That doesn't exist as much in China. So I think it's taken a long time for the critical establishment that does exist, which tends to be very highbrow, to come around to the idea of internet literature. But even now, those very academic and stuffy 小说家评论, like magazines that do highbrow literary criticism, they also now often have columns devoted to internet literature. They're starting to pay
mm,
attention to. But much more often, it is existing on the lowbrow level and going from internet novels directly to TV and movies. Many, many TV shows, maybe a majority or even a significant majority, at least of the TV shows I'm aware of in China that have been big in the last few years, are directly adapted from internet novels. So the flow
mm.
of this IP in and out of the internet novel space is very rapid and very lucrative. But the flow of commentary about it and discussion about it um, up vertically to middle brow and highbrow sort of cultural spheres does not seem to be as quick. It's happened very slowly.
Now, I was really keen to get you on this podcast because you've written an absolutely fascinating series on Substack entitled 13 Ways of Looking at Chinese Literature. Could you explain what this series is about and what led you to writing this?
Definitely. This is part of my Substack called the Cold Window Newsletter, which for the first part of when it was around, I was writing only about contemporary literary fiction. I read a lot of short stories, and that still is sort of where my heart is. But I also do translation and work with a lot of other translators at a charity called Paper Republic that focuses on Chinese literature. And I was realizing, as I started learning more about internet literature, that translators, readers, and especially publishers in the West seem very unfamiliar with the idea of internet literature. They don't seem to be aware a lot of the time that it exists at all, even though it is influential in China, for sure, but also in the West among young people in high school, in the United States at least, and in college, are now also starting to get very invested in these internet novels. We were talking about MXTX earlier and how her books jumped to the top of the New York Times bestseller list when they were first translated into English. That was a huge deal for us in the translation community because huge celebrity authors in China whose books are household names among Chinese readers, when they get translated into English, often barely make a blip. It's very hard to attract readers' attention. And yet, these translations that were being done by pseudonymous translators from a small press were being read by unbelievable numbers of young people who had never been interested in Chinese literature before. So that was the kind of thing that I thought really deserved attention and deserved more translators and publishers to be paying attention to. Clearly, there are books that Western readers want to read, and the only reason that they don't exist yet in English is because the people who are in charge of bringing the books over don't know about them yet. So that's why I wanted to make a sort of 13-step introductory resource to what these novels are, why they're worth paying attention to, what the problems with them are, but then also how to find the good ones. And the last few issues of my series have been more focused on what are the good ones? What are the novels that are worth reading out of this humongous sea of novels that have come out in the last 20 years?
I wonder if part of the issue is because web fiction is seen, you mentioned it's seen as a little bit lowbrow in China, but like it's seen as really quite déclassé in certainly in Britain. It's really strongly associated with fan fiction, essentially. Do you think that's been the main obstacle in like getting the attention from the right people in the industry?
It's possible, but the reason that web fiction tends to get stuck on non-monetized fan fiction and things like that, non-professional writing in the West, is that there aren't these payment systems, these contracting systems. I think that exist in China. In China, there isn't really a tradition there's not much of a tradition of print genre writing. Print has usually been reserved for literary writing, so a vast majority of new sci-fi in China, new fantasy in China, romance, thrillers, all this stuff that we think very naturally is part of the literary ecosystem in the West, even if it's not high literature. But we do think of that is part of literature. That is all online in China. So when we talk about web novels, it is far from just amateur fan fiction, although some of that is good too. But it also encompasses a lot of writing that we would actually consider more serious writing if it existed, if it was in English. So I think it really is more a lack of attention and awareness that has kept publishers away. And the other problem too is how long a lot of these novels are. It can be a big risk to commit to putting out a 10-volume series of print novels, of print editions that would cover only a single novel from Chinese. MXTX's novels that have sold so well in the US are between 6 and 10 volumes long. And that's not even close to the length of some of these truly behemoth male-oriented novels that run to 3,000 chapters. Those I don't even want to think about how many print editions those would have to be if they came out in English. So the amount of money it would take to translate those, the hassle it would be to get the rights from the Chinese side, and then also the risk of can we actually find a market for these, I think has made publishers wary of committing.
And seeing as we've touched on fan fiction, there's something I do have to ask about that was referred to in one of your pieces. Could you explain the romance between Lin Yu and Lord Voldemort?
Sure. I was really happy to find out about this when I was first starting to learn about Chinese internet fiction, because fan fiction is a big part of where the internet fiction industry comes from. And even though fan fiction is harder to monetize for copyright reasons, I think it is less common for there to be explicit fan fiction pairings in the super mainstream, like heavily marketed, contracted books. But in the vast world of fan writing and amateur internet writing, you get some really incredible pairings between romantic pairings in these novels. Chinese readers, especially like college-educated readers, who are often the people who are reading these novels, grow up with a huge amount of exposure, not just to traditional Chinese culture and traditional Chinese novels, but also Western culture and Western novels. All of the big commercial phenomenons of Western publishing of the last couple decades have also made a splash in China, and a lot of Chinese readers are aware of them. So a character like Tom Riddle from Harry Potter, who there's been God knows how much fan fiction written about him in English, also has a lot of fan fiction written about him in Chinese. And then the queen of fan fiction writing in Chinese for centuries has been Lin Yu, the protagonist of Dream of the Red Chamber. So it only makes sense that a cottage industry popped up of alternate universe stories shipping Tom Riddle with Lin Yu. And this sort of became very popular in the last, I think during the 2010s, may have been the height of this ship, if I have that right. And once people were aware this is the sort of novel you can write, it was everywhere. So now there's a whole canon of what's called Fu Dai. Fu is the first character of Voldemort's name in Chinese. Dai is Lin Yu. And Fu Dai, I haven't read any of them myself, but it seems really fun, and it's sort of a good encapsulation of the globalization of contemporary Chinese pop culture.
Yeah. And for any listeners who aren't familiar with Dream of the Red Chamber or Lin Yu is almost like every Bronte sisters heroine and every Jane Austen heroine rolled into one.
Yeah, I was going to say Juliet from Romeo and Juliet, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's all you have to do is say the name and you know exactly who you're talking about, because she's been the star of untold numbers of adaptations.
Can you talk about how the sort of reach of this format is starting to spread into the West, especially like from the Chinese, whether that's through other forms of like through adaptions or through like publishing? Can you describe the way it's starting to like make inroads into the West?
Well, I think it's important to clarify that it has had a very dedicated readership in the West for over a decade. Maybe since the early 2010s, there's been a large community, mostly of people of Chinese heritage, who read these stories and translated them for free outside of copyright on web forums into English. So that's been around for a long time. And these web forums and these sort of fan translators over the 2010s gradually started to build up enough of a readership and enough capital to make a handful of fan translation websites that then many of them have shut down by now, but the ones that have stuck around, one is called Wuxia World. The other big one is called Web Novel. And these have partnerships with the large distributors in China. So now they're not fan translations anymore. Now they're actually within copyright licensed translations of these stories being released on a chapter-by-chapter basis that resembles quite closely the Chinese model. So that is how most of these novels are reaching Western audiences now, is on these free or subscription translation websites that release them chapter by chapter. But these websites are really limited. The translation quality can vary quite considerably. The number of novels that they're able to put out is pretty small because the teams are small, and because the readership is small. There still aren't that many internet users in the English-speaking world who are paying attention to this. So it still is only covering a tiny sliver of what's coming out in China. And also, they have their own biases, these platforms. Both Web Novel and Wuxia World are much more interested in the sort of martial arts or video game-inspired, male reader-oriented side of things. And that leaves a lot of the female-oriented novels in the lurch. A lot of the really good danmei novels historically have not had any platform on the English internet to get read. And that's why they typically have to be translated by unpaid fan translators working with pseudonyms, some of them learning Chinese in order to do the translation in the first place, putting them out on their personal blogs. And that's sort of been the state of the field for a long time. A small number of male-oriented platforms paying a little bit of money to the translators to publish within copyright, and then a ton of decentralized female-oriented blogs coming out with non-professional translations. That was true until, I think it was 2021, that MXTX's print edition started coming out in English, and proved to Western publishing that you can not just make money, but that you can make huge amounts of money and attract really huge fan bases if you take the risk and put these novels out in print. So because MXTX is a danmei author, there have now been hundreds and hundreds of danmei novels that have been officially translated within copyright and put out in print editions in English in the West. But I think because publishing is conservative and averse to risk, none of the print publishers are really willing to branch out of the already proven path of danmei and try any of the other dozens of genres. I'm aware at the moment of literally only 3 internet novels that are non-danmei that have ever come out in a print edition in English, compared with the hundreds and hundreds of danmei novels. So I think that that's a tide that's got to break sooner or later. So,
can you talk about how the writers navigate the restrictions on what can and cannot be published in China, and how they respond to those limitations?
Yeah, I wish I was an expert on this because there are experts who know a lot more than me. Again, I encounter this mostly from the side of the reader, so I don't get to see much of what authors choose not to write about. I only see what they choose to write about. But I can say, as somebody who reads the internet novels and who reads the literary novels both, the censorship and the limitations on what authors themselves choose to say of internet novels seems much more unpredictable than literary novels. I mean, censorship in Chinese publishing is usually self-censorship. There's not that much explicit red lines in the sand about what you can and can't write. It's more often platforms or publishers or authors themselves deciding not to take risks and to stay conservative just out of the fear that their work will be taken down. But if you're a young if you're a young internet author, and you're trying to carve out attention for yourself in this very cutthroat industry, I find a lot of young authors are willing to push boundaries and take risks and write things that are not against any explicit rules, but maybe a little bit more daring than what you'd often see in literary fiction. So there's still queer subtext everywhere in Chinese internet novels, even though since those crackdowns in the mid-2010s, more explicit homoerotic content is not allowed anymore. But there's still queer subtext everywhere. And there's also a lot of explicit feminist content in a lot of these novels. There's a genre that I only found out about somewhat recently that is, can't remember the Chinese name for it, but it's an explicitly feminist genre that writes fantasy and sci-fi stories in which nearly the entire cast is female, and the challenge of the authors is to write a story in which gender oppression has never existed in any form. Typically, there's no heterosexual romance. There's either no romance in the stories or it's lesbian romance. And this sort of like explicitly feminist writing that is intended to comment on real world gendered violence and oppression is very hard to do in the current ecosystem of literary writing in China. But people are experimenting with it in the literary side. So I'm sure the censorship still exists and exists widely, and there are some of these notorious crackdowns that have happened, but the risk-taking seems much clearer in the internet side than it does on the literary side.
I noticed from what we're discussing that internet fiction can be used to get into themes that aren't as centered in the Chinese mainstream. So, for instance, like homosexual relationships and that kind of stuff. Is that just done for titillation because it's like something people find erotic or exciting? Or do you think there's any sort of exploration of like social themes in there as well?
I think there definitely is. This is true of the internet the world over. The best version of the internet is the internet that allows you to form community with other people of similar interests or identity to you, even if you're not the majority in society. And that's true of the Chinese internet as well. So I think the queer exploration within Chinese internet novels often is a place for queer people to express themselves in a way that isn't really ever explicitly allowed in other forms of mainstream Chinese cultural production. This is for sure true in other areas of social commentary also. There's a novel that I've been reading recently called Global Examination. It's been translated to English. It's one of these Danmei novels that's gotten an English print run from a Singaporean publishing house. But it's also one of these Danmei novels that is sort of taking the Danmei filter and putting it over a very interesting social commentary horror/sci-fi story that is all based on the Chinese Gaokao system, the high school entrance exam, which is a really brutal and stressful rite of passage that Chinese students have to go through when they're 17 and 18. And this novel is all about young people from around the world getting forcibly thrown into a cruel, strange, omniscient examination system and having to fight their way through it and figure out a way to escape the constant threats of proctors who are enforcing arbitrary rules and questions that seem to be asking things that they couldn't possibly be expected to know. Like, it's every chapter is both funny and it's a horror novel, so it's also frightening, exciting. Like, I can understand why this novel is so popular, because it's a cathartic way to express the absurdity of the Gaokao system. That's just an example, but there are many novels like this that take aspects of Chinese society and put a genre, entertaining but also like very penetrating twist on them.
And sorry, what was the name of that one again?
The English name is Global Examination, 全球高考 by Mu Shuli.
I might have to look that one up. That one sounds absolutely very, very interesting.
I recommend it.
We've talked about the limitations, but what would you say makes the Chinese internet publishing scene exciting today?
I think it's how fast it moves. I've always been attracted to how well contemporary literature tracks the extremely rapid changes in Chinese society, the ways that technology is changing China and the ways that globalization is changing China, get reflected really well in the writings of young authors. That's why when I translate and when I write criticism, I always focus on authors born in the 90s and the 80s, usually, because they're the ones who are paying really close attention to how fast China is changing. When we read about China in the West, we're often hearing about China as it was a couple years ago, or in the worst cases, a couple decades ago. And when we read novels, translated novels especially, they often tend to be pretty old or by older authors. So that's why I love contemporary literature. And contemporary internet literature is that dialed up to an even higher degree. These novels are tracking China as it's changing in real time, the interest that people have, the sorts of crazy collisions between Western pop culture and Chinese pop culture are all getting laid out very explicitly on the page in these novels. I mean, they're not going through long editing cycles. These authors aren't even really thinking too hard about what they're writing down. They're just trying to write down what is going to appeal to readers as quickly as possible in this moment. So the fact that we can, in an entertaining and instantaneous way, see where Chinese young people's brains are at is really exciting. And yeah, it's why I'm so grateful to fan translators who put in the work to translate this stuff, because by the time it has been professionally translated and edited and published, and or you're holding it in your hands in English, that moment in Chinese culture could have long passed. China just changes much too quickly.
So in light of that, what trends are developing in the online scene at the moment in April 2026 when we're having this conversation?
I can think of a couple that I've noticed. I'm seeing a big rush, it seems like, in Dungeons and Dragons-esque stories. I know that was popular in Japan a few years ago, and now seems to be coming to China, for sure. There was one that I came across recently that is narrated by a mushroom spore creature in a level 1 Dungeons and Dragons dungeon. And it's writing about like being part of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign from the perspective of a grunt enemy that can be defeated on the first floor. That's like a very old school Western trope, but it seems to be getting big in China right now. I'm seeing a lot of cooking stories. Slice of life stories have been, yeah. I think there were a couple cooking themed novels that became popular in China a few years ago, and people seem to be jumping on that train now. Definitely in the last few years, it seems like every other story is a system novel, which means that it's about somebody suddenly gaining access to like a video game quest pane in their daily life. And they go about their novels about somebody who's a chef or who's a football star. American football star is one of these novels, or a police officer, or a medieval Chinese martial artist. Like, it doesn't matter who the person is. They wake up one day and they have a quest pane telling them what they have to do that day and what their reward will be if they can fill the quest. And then they level up like they're playing a video game, but in their daily life. That seems to be very, very, very common now. And those are pretty fun to read because there's a story like it's a novel, but it also feels a little bit like a video game that you're watching your character level up and gain new skills, unlock new powers. And then the last thing that I would say is I brought up the genre of explicit feminist web novels before. This is something I'm seeing in Chinese popular culture in all domains, movies and literary novels too. But I think this is especially true in the web novels, explicit feminist themes, and looking much more directly at systems of gender depression is something that Chinese young readers want right now. And it's something that younger authors are meeting the demand for, writing explicit feminist stories.
It's very interesting to me that some of these genres seem quite formulaic, like what you mentioned about the sort of video game people. You wake up and you're living in a video game, or like the sort of cultivation genre. Why do you think that sort of set format and that sort of tropes? Why do you think that seems so popular?
Well, I think the formulaicness of it comes mostly from the commercial structure. You have to maintain the reader's interest over the course of years. If you're coming out with a chapter a day and you're writing a 3,000 chapter novel, that's 10 years of content that you have to be able to keep people interested in. You have to keep them on the edge of their seat all the way along. This is more common, I think, especially in the male-oriented adventure, fighting, video game, level up novels. But the balance that these authors always seem to be striking is between having the story be repetitive and predictable enough that you feel comfortable in it. You can sort of turn off your brain while you're reading it. You know what you're going to find. And also that it feels fresh every time. So you don't just feel, you don't lose interest and move on to the next one. At some point, every novel loses its freshness and the author has to move on. And hopefully the author sees that coming and ends the novel before that happens. I think the female-oriented novels tend to be a little bit better about that than the male-oriented ones. But that's always the challenge in serialized fiction, is how to keep it formulaic in a comforting way, but boundary pushing and exciting in a plot way. So a lot of these novels I find are written in blocks. There's sort of a block of 10 or 20 or 30 chapters that are telling one complete story, and you have an arc in that story. But then the blocks themselves just sort of stack up and tend to be very formulaic. Each 30-chapter block is similar to every other 30-chapter block. It's just the characters are getting more powerful between each one.
Interesting. It really is like a video game then.
Yeah, like I said, it looks like a novel, but it's really just a video game written in text in a lot of these cases.
So if anyone's interested in trying internet literature and translation, or they want to read more about what you've written, where's the best place to start? What's the most accessible place for them to look?
I think previously there hasn't really been a great place to jump in. So that's why I've been working on a resource that should be coming out at the very beginning of May. That is a guide for people who haven't read this stuff yet to some of the highest quality, most literary and most interesting internet novels that exist out there, many of which already have translations. For this resource, I've been talking to professional translators, fan translators. I've been talking to internet authors, researchers in China, anybody who works in this space professionally, some editors at these major web novel platforms too. I've been asking them to recommend one or two of their favorite underappreciated web novels that they would like somebody who's never read this stuff before to start with. And I've collected now many of their heartfelt recommendations. I'm working on translating them into English right now, so that I'll have sort of a beginner's guide for people who are interested in this stuff to explore it. I'm really hoping this will get more publishers, translators, and ordinary readers to take this genre seriously.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show description. Anyway, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
That was Andrew Rule. If you would like to find out more about this topic, there's a link to Andrew's writing in the show description. The Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding is a charity which has worked to promote understanding and friendship between the British and Chinese people since 1965. If you would like to find out more or get involved, visit sacu.org. If there are any other topics you would like to hear this podcast discuss, or if you have any feedback, please contact us via the email address in the show description. The music is Chopin's Grand Valse Brillante, Opus number 18, produced by Gregor Quentel and released under a Creative Commons license. This podcast was written, produced and edited by me, Joseph Edmonds. Goodbye.